Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Fan, and today I will be presenting my capstone project topic on the effects on Canadian gas prices in the past 5 to 10 years. To start, I'd like to highlight that gas prices have been shown to spike irregularly in the past few decades. Now, I'm pretty sure that anyone here who was born around the 1990s can attest to once seeing that the prices were 3 digits long and not 4 digits long as seen today. Regardless, I think the data I have for you today will show certain trends and correlations affecting these gas prices. These are the highlights for the presentation. I will provide my notebook and GitHub repository link for my code on submission and by request. This is the most important data to follow. For a quick introduction, these are the average gas prices across several Canadian major cities. The data will range from the start of 2018 to May of this year, 2025. The data goes by months and is divided into three different categories. We have base, tax, and total, and they're all underneath a column called tax status. The most important thing to note is the gas total is the sum of the base and tax statuses. And just to make sure that we're on the same page, these prices, their units are measured in cents per liters. Here we have the import prices on refined petroleum and crude oil by the millions. The data also goes by months and ranges from the beginning of 2019 to April 2022. Now, you might recall that at the beginning I highlighted the major economic disturbance in the past decade. I'm sure it may not come as a surprise, but that disturbance was COVID-19. There is a lot of data that will tell you how much of a hit most industries, but above all, the economy took during the lockdowns. We won't be looking too deeply into COVID, but only the direct effects it plays on the gas prices to stay within the scope of the project. Since 2019, we've heard a lot about the carbon tax, and I find that it plays a huge role in the rise in gas prices. This little excerpt that I found briefly highlights and summarizes the carbon tax within the past half decade. It was mainly introduced to mitigate carbon content from many industries, but as a consequence, it also affects the consumer, which is us. Now for the next section, data cleaning. Here we have some data from the Canadian gas prices data frame. The data type of the dates, it wasn't in the proper date time type, and we also do not need the day to be shown since the data is is just monthly based. The first day of the month would always be shown if we didn't format it. It would always show the very first day of the month. The next thing that we cleaned up here is the imports data frame contained a description on the very bottom row of the CSV. Also, I noticed that the values on the CSV were shown to be ending in decimals. So for better readability, I actually changed these to int using a cast lambda function here. Now, you may recall that the gas prices earlier were sorted by dates and on top of that, further separated by tax status. In order to organize the plots and data, here we divide them into three different data frames solely by tax status, which are conveniently the same for every three rows. Separating the prices into three different data frames will give us three different graphs, and these are what they will look like. The first one is the average total tax. Sorry, this is the average total gas prices plot. On the x-axis is the month and year, while the y-axis is the price in cents per liter. The legend is interactive, so here you can hide the other lines. For the first plot, I want to highlight these lines and how very similar the trends are. These are major cities in Ontario, and if you were to observe the lowest peak of the lines, you will see that the gas prices were at their lowest during COVID lockdown. You may be thinking that these are just Ontario cities, so they follow this pattern. However, if you were to reveal St. John's, Newfoundland, we can see that the lines are still very similar and are close to overlapping. and that gas prices were still at the lowest during lockdown. This is adding in Calgary, Alberta. It's even less of a coincidence now when you look at it. And finally, we have everything that's added in. So as you can see here, these lines are close to overlapping, and this definitely indicates a pattern. Now remember, the total gas price is a combination of tax and base value between each city. This is the plot for tax on gas across a few major cities. We can see that the tax is rising between the period when the carbon tax was introduced federally to then dip close to present day. There's more correlation between tax on gas and the carbon tax that I will show once we reach the correlation section of this presentation, but for now, I want to show the rise in tax on gas around the same time as the carbon tax. And this is just a side-by-side comparison between the base gas price and total gas price between each major city. After scaling the same height, we can see how closely they resemble each other, which proves how proportional base and total price are with one another. Now, on to data correlation. We're going to first look at the COVID-19 lockdown period's import of refined petroleum and crude oil. You'll see that there's a mutual effect here because the lockdown also affects base gas prices on top of the amount in millions spent on petroleum and crude oil imports. I'll further explain the correlation between the tax on gas and carbon tax once we reach a different slide. So here are the bar graphs showing the amount of money spent in millions for the import of petroleum and crude oil. The most notable thing is the big dip between January 2020 and July 2020. Imports were at their lowest during COVID lockdown because no one was really importing or exporting since many industries closed globally during the pandemic. And then here we can see the dip in base gas prices is also directly related to the dip in petroleum and crude oil imports. They were at their lowest during COVID lockdown. Here we have the mean gas price and the price of gas during COVID. And this graph shows how affected gas prices were during lockdown. These prices were all below the mean gas price line, as you can see here. The mean gas price for each city was accumulated from the beginning of 2019 to May of 2025. Earlier, I showed that the tax on gas is connected to the carbon tax. To further elaborate, we have this figure provided by Carbon Direct that shows each province and territory system on the carbon tax. Now, the focal point of carbon tax here is the consumer pay aspect of the carbon tax. At around 2022, the tax drops instead of continually rises for areas such as Calgary and Regina. If you look at the figure on the left, you can see that the carbon tax applies partially to Alberta and Saskatchewan. And these are the biggest dips in taxes, but we can also see that other provinces in stripes also drop and eventually return to rise. Meanwhile, Quebec and BC have their own provincial system, and we can see that Montreal and Vancouver constantly rises with no drop. The final correlation that I want to reveal is there's a massive drop in tax on gas at the very end of the graph, and there's a reason for it. The reason is because right after the election, the government overhauled the carbon tax. So what that means is the fuel charge is $0 nationally going forward and into present day. So after correlating all this data, what can we expect? We can see that petroleum and crude oil imports are closely connected to the total average gas prices. In supply and demand for petroleum and crude oil, gas is more expensive when we import more than export, and also vice versa. In conclusion, we can expect gas prices to steadily decrease or stabilize with the overhaul of the carbon tax. Now, this may end up being false though if the consumer pay fuel charge returns, but in the long run, we can pretty much expect prices to stabilize. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you for listening.